Thank you for the introduction. First, I would like to introduce myself. As I already said, my name is Stefan Schumacher. I started to working with computers with this beautiful East German small computer with 1.4 megahertz and data saved on a music cassette, as you can see on the right side to the computer, the music cassette recorder where we stored our data on. I've been a hacker for more than 20 years. I've been involved with the Netbeast project. I studied educational science and psychology, and I currently work as a security researcher. My main focus is, of course, as a psychologist, psychology of security. I do research about social engineering, security awareness. I gave a talk last year about the psychology of security here at DeepSec. I did a lot of research on psychological profiling for social engineering attacks and the evaluation of security awareness campaigns. And these are some parts that will also show through in this talk. I also do some trainings for German law enforcement community and armed forces, and also some politicians who like to abuse the term cyber. And I published some articles and books on this topic. For those of you who don't already know, last year we published the DeepSec Chronicles Volume 1. It's proceedings of the DeepSec, and it can be gotten at the front desk. And in this book, I published my article on the psychology of security. 2 years ago, I was at a conference in Australia, and some guy tweeted about my talk, and he said, "Science is awesome, you aren't doing science in InfoSec, why not?" Seems to be the overriding message of my talk. And that's what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to bring science into IT security. So stand back, I'm going to try science. And there's another exceptional permission I got. I got the permission A38 to use cyber in all forms and shapes. I'm going to make use of that word. So in the last years, I've given talks on cyber war on the horizon. I think in 2010 here at DeepSec, I gave a talk on cyber war, on cyber terrorism. Does cyber terrorism exist as a unique form of terrorism and such for the German Defense Department? And there's currently a huge debate going on in the media and politics. And unfortunately, not every journalist and politician understands cyber. So we have a media hype going on, probably in other countries too. Yesterday, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, a large newspaper and usually respected newspaper in Germany, published an article where they claimed that Russia is going to hack the German federal election in 2017. They didn't give any sources, they cited themselves. And they spread some FUD about our elections next year going on. And that's another example of what's going on in the media. Another thing that happens in IT security or in companies is to say that we got hacked by state-sponsored elite cyber war hackers, usually from China and or Russia, which usually sounds better than we didn't pay for security analysis, we got infected with the crypto Trojan and forgot to make backups. That's how you can cover your own fuck-ups in IT, and that's currently also a huge problem. Now we got two prominent cases in Germany in the beginning of this year, in February, March 2016. An hospital was shut down, the IT of a hospital was shut down by crypto Trojan, and in the same time frame, the town council of a small town in Bavaria, including their local energy company, got shut down because they got infected with the crypto Trojan, and the town didn't have any backups, so they had to pay the ransomware. They had to pay a Bitcoin to get their machines up and running and to deliver gas and electricity to their customers. So we also have these problems here. We have huge problems when we discuss cyber war and hacking capabilities. There are articles published in newspapers and journals how Russia or China or Israel or the US have the best hackers in the world, and they have the best cyber war units and divisions and whatever they have there. So the problem I see is how can we assess the hacking capabilities of actors without too much political bullshit and a sound scientific foundation. That's what I as a psychologist want to do. I do want a sound scientific foundation. Measuring or assessing things is the core competency of psychology. When you study psychology, you spend so much time on how to measure things, because measuring things is pretty hard when you do psychology or social science in general or humanities. Computer science, electrical engineering, natural science like physics or chemistry have a different theory of science, a different history, and they do things different than we do in social sciences and humanities. Unfortunately, most people in IT security have a computer science or EE or natural science background, so they are trained in a different way of measuring things. There is a nice saying by Heinz von Förster, who was born here in Vienna, studied physics and moved to the US, where he presided over the first cybernetics conferences, and he said the hard sciences are only successful because they are discussing soft problems. They are measuring things that can be easily measured. And that's a huge problem when we do psychology or social science or other related sciences. We shall not fall for variables that can be measured easily. There have been articles published in newspapers where they claim that one country is spending $5 million on creating a hacker unit for its army, and $5 million is so much money. And they spend more than another country, and therefore the country who spends $5 million is much better than the country who spends only $2.5 million. But that might be a fallacy you fell for. You can't say that the guys who spend more money get better hackers or better cyber units. When I look at this problem with my psychologist's hat on, I see that cyber or security or hacking capabilities or everything having to do with cyber are usually constructs. We work in psychology with constructs, or I've one definition of security I use. Security is a latent social construct and has to be treated as such. We need psychological and sociological methods and tools. If the security of a system should be enhanced, we need diagnosis, prognosis, and intervention. And that's the core competency of psychology. And that's what we do as psychologists usually. Even if we don't work as therapists, even if we work in industrial psychology, maybe doing assessment centers for human resources, we do the same things. We make diagnosis, prognosis, and intervention. So what is a construct? A construct in psychology differs, of course, from the construct we use in computer science or programming. A construct is something we cannot measure directly. We cannot use a method, a tool, or some other thing to measure a construct directly. I can measure your height or your age, but I cannot measure directly, for example, your intelligence. Intelligence quotient, is probably the most popular or most known construct we use in psychology. We have to find variables we can measure, and these measured variables then add up to the construct we have. The same applies to security. We cannot measure security directly. We cannot run a program and count the dots and commas in source code and say we have a better security if we have more dots than commas or something like that. So we need an operationalization of security. We have to make it measurable, like people did or psychologists did with intelligence and still are doing so with intelligence. That means we have several questions to be answered. What exactly is hacking? There's a huge discussion, and different cultures have different definitions of what hacking means. But hacking is probably more than having a degree in computer science, attending a conference, and maybe using a script to exploit a vulnerability. What differs, or what's the difference between a hacker and a script kiddie? We all use these terms and know the terms usually, and there have to be made some discriminations between them. What is a cyber attack? What is cyber war? I gave a huge talk on it in 2010 about the discussion of this definition. And then we have to measure the capabilities of hackers or IT security specialists or script kiddies or whoever is an actor in that field. So we have to make a definition and find ways to measure it. A well-known example is intelligence. When we want to measure things, we have three things to keep in mind, or these are the three things we use in psychology to measure the quality of a measurement, if it's a good test or a bad test. The first thing that we have to keep in mind is reliability, which means the overall consistency of a measure. The measurement produces similar results under consistent conditions. If I do the test again and again under the same conditions, we have to get the same results. That's a pretty simple thing. The objectivity is something that means that the standard of a research study, such as hypotheses, choices of variables analyzed, gauges made, methods of control and observations, are lacking bias as much as is possible. Unfortunately, in psychology, there are things where we do have a bias. We have a list of known biases in psychology, and these biases sometimes fuck up or destroy the objectivity of a test. For example, whenever a test is interpretative. You probably have seen the Rorschach test, where you get some ink on a paper and then you have to explain what you see. And your answer is getting interpreted by the psychologist, by the therapist, which makes it very, very low in objectivity, because 5 different psychologists will give 5 different explanations of what you see in this ink. And that's not really objective. So objectivity is a huge, huge problem in psychology. The other thing is validity. We have several constructs of validity, but the most important one is construct validity, which means the magnitude to which an analyzer or tool is able to gauge an abstract characteristic, capacity, or construct. Am I measuring what I'm thinking I'm measuring? If I measure intelligence, do I really measure intelligence, or do I just measure mathematical skills, or language skills, or other skills? Oh, sorry. There is one example of a test that was absolutely not valid, or a method that was absolutely not valid. It's called Phrenology. Maybe some of you have already seen these pictures. Back in the 19th and 18th century, medicines, physicians, and the first forerunners of psychology thought that the form, the shape of your head can be used to determine what kind of intelligence you have. Some French scientists claimed that you can tell if someone is a criminal from the form of the eyes and the head. And we know nowadays that this doesn't work, because the physical representation of your head, the shape of your head, has nothing to do with your intelligence, or if you're a criminal or not. There are much other factors, or many other factors that come into play. But for several decades, this method was used. And most prominently, probably in Nazi Germany in the Second World War, they used this to identify Germans and Jews, or people who had Jewish heritage, or gypsies as a heritage, or who were unworthy of living. And this is, of course, not an objective test. It's actually bullshit. Another thing is, 3 years ago at Deep Intel, I gave a talk on profiling for social engineering attacks, or psychological profiling. And I brought in this as an example. The Myers-Briggs type indicator, which is not very popular in Europe, or at least not in Germany and Austria and Switzerland, but it is very popular in the US. And the difference between the US and Germany in this case is that the German Wikipedia says in its very first sentence, it's not scientific. It's not a scientific test. But in the US, it's very popular, and it is used pretty often by human resources because it can be easily applied. It was developed by two ladies, Myers and Briggs, during the Second World War, and they used the ideas of C.G. Jung and Freud and tried to create an easy applicable test for human resources. Because there was a labor shortage, the men were fighting in the Second World War, and the women were staying at home and now had to work in companies. And therefore they tried to create this kind of wheel where you have several dimensions of cognitive functions, and they created several easy questions, or a questionnaire that can be easily answered, and then you got sorted into this dimensions of your cognitive functions, and according to this wheel you got sorted into the profession or the job you had to fulfill. But it is not scientific sound, because it is not based on empirical data. That's the biggest problem with it. It's based on Jung and Freud and Jung did not use scientifically empirical sound data. They used literature and storytelling and stories to create the idea of psychology. Another thing is a story always told by a professor of psychological research. After Second World War in the early 1950s, Americans moved over to Italy, and they tried to apply an intelligence test to children. They developed a test for children because children can't read and they can't use written intelligence tests, so they used pictures. And they asked the American children, what is missing in at that house? What's the part that's missing at that house? Any idea? Not the electrical wire, but the chimney is missing. The chimney is missing at the house. And then they moved over to Italy, and over 90% of Italian children answered, the crucifix over the door is missing. So you see, you also have a cultural influence when you're doing such measurements, be it the chimney or the crucifix on a house or some other things. And this is something that had to be figured out by psychologists in the last decades. And we did figure it out, and that's the reason why currently intelligence tests usually test for mathematics, because mathematics is the same in every culture. We don't do logical tests much or reasoning from stories, because that has to, or often has too big of cultural influence. So now let's have a look at the traditional military measurements. I spoke about cyber, and cyber war. So we have to have a look into cyber war capabilities. Some guys claim that Russia or China has the best cyber war units, cyber war divisions, brigades, or whatever. And now I just took a look into the history book and looked up traditional military measurements. We have whenever we speak about war, we can see that we have a run between sword and shield. No? Someone who gets in technological advancement can get into or can take more risk. That means he can attack someone, he can overrun his opponent, or can do other things. And we had such events in history, and I've just taken some from the recent history. For example, of course, when speaking in Austria, the Austro-Prussian War in 1866, which removed Austria from the Holy Roman Empire. And the main factors for Prussia to win were first the Dresden needle gun. It was a new rifle. The rifle allowed the Prussian soldiers to lay down while firing. The Austrians had to stand up, so they were an easy target. When the Austrians reloaded, the Prussians could shoot them because the Prussians were laying down on the floor. And many people attributed the win to the Dresden needle gun, or in German it's called Zündnadelgewehr, which is probably known at least to the Germans and Austrian here. There were other factors that are not that prominent when speaking about the Austro-Prussian War, which means Germany had a working rail network. We invested a lot of money into our rail network, and we put in strategic tracks so we could move our soldiers pretty easily from northern Germany to the battlefields at the Austrian border. And the third thing was the command structure. Germany set up the general staff in the 1820s, and they organized everything. They had a plan in their desks. They already had war games played through what might happen if Austria attacks us. And that Austria didn't the same thing, so they were not prepared to the same extent as Prussia was. Another example, which also marks the beginning of the First World War, is the Anglo-German naval arms race. Which means that in 1906, the UK or the Brits developed a new type of battleship, the dreadnought, a dreadnought class. And with that dreadnought, they outclassed every existing naval ship in the world. It was armored, it had better and bigger cannons, and therefore the old ships already existing couldn't compete with it, giving Britain a new role, a new advance on the navy or on the naval field. They knew that the dreadnought and their sister ships would be very expensive, but they calculated that they could build more dreadnoughts than the German Empire. Because Germany also had to keep up the armed forces or the army, because France or Russia was a threat to the German Empire, and therefore Germany could not spend as much money as the UK on navy ships. Unfortunately, the German general staff didn't think the same, and they tried to spend out the UK. Which didn't work much, but it led to a major political crisis in Germany. It led to the birth of the first social democratic party in the world, and it led to Otto von Bismarck becoming the new chancellor of the German Empire. And that later evolved into the events leading to the First World War. It wasn't the event that set up or started First World War, but it was a major factor in starting the First World War. During First World War, there were artillery battles. So those with the bigger range, the better accuracy, and more rounds per minute of artillery could win the battles. And in Germany, Krups is pretty popular or a well-known name because he developed new types of artillery. And we could actually beat the French or British artillery at that time. Another thing that happened during the First World War was the use of chemical weapons in 1914 by the French army, and all armies had to develop personal protective equipment. I don't know if you've seen pictures or photos from the first gas attacks. They usually gave the soldiers just some piece of clothes with water, and they kept this clothes in front of their nose. They didn't have protective masks, just a piece of clothes in front of their mouth and nose, and they usually died under very bad circumstances. And this led to a race between chemical weapons and personal protective equipment. So chemists on both sides, on all sides, tried to develop gas that could break the gas masks and kill the people, even if they use gas masks. Another development which is quite interesting if you talk about information warfare or electronic warfare is the concept that mostly was developed by Heinz von Guderian, a German general and commander of the tank troops. He developed a concept of a new command structure, and he used radios in every tank and fire on the move, because he came from an infantry background, and he used tanks like an infantryist would, or an infantryman would do an attack. Before that, in First World War, the tanks moved up to a hill and were used like artillery. So they moved up a hill, took a direction and shot, and then they moved to the next hill and shot like artillery. Guderian changed it and shot from the move. And thus, that led to the first successes of the German troops in Second World War, which is later called Blitzkrieg by the Brits. And these are some historical developments or things that happened when talking about war. And we see this was also driven, or every time driven, by some kind of technology. When we nowadays want to compare state actors, we usually look at their production capabilities. What are they able to produce? Do they have enough money to produce aircraft, anti-aircraft system, naval systems? Do they have domestic supplier? Can they build an aircraft, a Navy battleship on their own, or do they have to buy it somewhere else? Another measurement is if the actor is a nuclear weapon state. There are officially, I think, 8 nuclear weapon states, with Israel using some kind of ambiguation technology or ambiguation strategy. They don't admit that they have nuclear weapons, but we assume they do have weapons. And we do have states that can produce nuclear weapons easily. Think of Germany and Japan, both high-tech nations. We don't have German nuclear weapons. The Japanese don't have nuclear weapons, but if we are under threat, we can produce them very easily because we have nuclear power plants. And we have the technology to create a nuclear weapon if we are under attack or under threat. Another measurements usually are broken down into numbers. For example, have a look at the CIA fact book. It's quite a great collection of statistics and data. It was written before Wikipedia existed, and it was given out to military personnel, diplomats, and so on. And it's just usually a list of facts and statistics on every country on the earth. For example, you can look up how many active personnel the German armed forces have, the Austrian armed forces have, Switzerland, and so on. How many reserve personnel they have, how many of their budget in percent of GDP they spend on military stuff. You have a look at their population, number, age, how the pyramid looks. And that's another interesting thing. There's a phenomenon or a measurement called use bulge. It's used by political scientists and historians. It's basically the number of young men compared to the number of old men. Young men can be disposed of, or sometimes they have to be disposed of. There are some kind of disposable heroes if you're into Metallica. We have countries like Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, big parts of Africa, China, where they have 5 to 10, or where 25 to 50% of the country consists of persons under the age of 35. Now, for example, Afghanistan, 50% of the population of Afghanistan is younger than 25 years. And this leads to problems. You often have the problem that in these societies, the 3rd, 4th, or 5th son can't inherit anything. He doesn't get any money from his parents. He has to make his luck on his own, and there is no work for him. There are no jobs. So they go out and work as soldiers of fortune. They become terrorists, radicals, or move to other countries to work there for cheap money. A lot of, I think, Indians and Pakistanis are working in Saudi Arabia mostly as slave labor. And that is used as a predictor if a country is able to have a war. If you have the problem or the phenomenon like in Europe or Japan that you don't have young people, you don't have a second son in the families. You mostly have only one child or maybe 2 children. Families with only 2 children don't want to send their children to war. And that leads to the situation that countries like Europe or Japan or the continent of Europe or the European Union has to invest money into the automatization of warfare. That's why we develop robots, terminators and such, and that's why we are into or interested in cyber war, because this might be a field where we don't lose persons or we don't have people killed in action on our side. Another thing are war games or Kriegsspiele. They were developed or invented by the Prussian general staff in the 19th century, and they are basically just big maneuvers. And these are a good preparation for battles. Sometimes you have countries where the army only has been deployed on paper. They don't have any real experience with how it is to be in a war or to be in a task force. An example for a war game would be the Strong European Tank Challenge. It's a challenge done every 2 or 5 years, usually in Germany, where tank companies from all over Europe or from all over NATO gather, and they have a battle, a war game prepared with typical tank battle maneuvers, and they are usually won by Germany every year, and followed usually by Denmark and Poland or the Netherlands, because they all use Leopard 2 tanks, the same tanks, and they always outrun the American and British forces which are using their own tanks, which is quite interesting. Now, let's have a look into war. We have to find a definition of what a war is if you want to discuss cyber war. Wikipedia says that war is an organized violent conflict of extreme aggression between at least 2 groups with mortality. There are several other definitions. For example, ZIPRI, the Swedish Institute of Peace Research, lists the number of how many people have to die. I think it was 100 or something like that. So they say everything below 100 is not a war, but maybe a local conflict. I prefer another definition of a Prussian officer born close to Magdeburg in 1780. His name is Karl von Clausewitz, and he later became the general and director of the Prussian Military Academy. He died of cholera in 1831, and his book was called On War, oder Vom Kriege in German, was published in 1832 by his widow. He wrote this book for the then German princess to learn about war, about the art of war. It wasn't a cookbook like maybe Sun Tzu's book or other books, but he did a real dialectical, theoretical discussion of war. He wrote the first scientific book about war as a science, or as a field of science. And therefore Clausewitz wrote the book on war. If you want to discuss how a war works, go to Clausewitz. It's almost 200 years old, but it still works, and it also works in the cyber domain. His definition of war is nothing but a duel on an extensive scale. War, therefore, is an act of violence intended to compel our opponent to fulfill our will. And that's the most important part of this definition, to compel our opponent to fulfill our will. Now, if I do this in cyberspace, if I want to lead a cyber war, I have to compel my opponent to fulfill my will by using cyber attacks. And then comes the question, does that work? Can maybe Russia force Germany to surrender by using only cyber attacks? Or are traditional attacks still necessary? He also said that war is a mere continuation of policy by other means. It has no purpose by itself. It's often misinterpreted. He doesn't say that politics stops and war takes over, but he says that the policy have to give objectives of war. There are goals that have to be reached. These can be either limited aims, or to disarm an opponent and render him politically helpless or military impotent. That's called total war, the last example. It happened last century, for example, in 1945, with the surrender of Germany and Japan. Germany and Japan decided to exist as a political entity. There was no country of Germany anymore, only the occupied zones. And the German armed, or the country of Germany was politically helpless and military impotent. It didn't exist anymore. And that's the outcome of a total war. But you can also have limited aims. For example, that parts of nowadays Ukraine are imported or taken into the Russian state. Think of Odessa and what's going on there in Crimea, or Crimea, how it's called in English. There are also other things, for example, that the US doesn't want to allow Iran to produce or to build nuclear power plants or nuclear weapons. That's also a limited aim that can be achieved. He also talked about tactics and strategy, and in my opinion, cyber war or cyber only works on the tactical level. Tactics is a theory of the use of military forces in combat, whereas strategy is the theory of the use of combats for the object of the war. Strategy is the big picture on how to win a war. Tactic is how to fight a battle or how to win a battle, so you can be able to win the war. There is another great quotation from him. He says, it may sound strange, but for all who knew war in this respect, it is a fact beyond doubt that much more strength of will is required to make an important decision in strategy than in tactics. And he puts a huge emphasis on tactics because his book was written for the future empire, or for the future emperor of Germany and the leader of the armed forces. The emperor wasn't working as a sergeant living in the trenches and giving commands to single soldiers. He had to lead all armies to reach their success in war. So if we take Clausewitz as a base for cyber war, I can say cyber war is a mere continuation of policy by other means. It has no purpose by itself. It must be embedded into a political strategy, and just doing some hacking can be considered a skirmishing, but not as a strategy or even a war. We always have to have this, you have to see that these operations are embedded into political goals, into strategic goals, and in my opinion, we cannot compel our opponent to fulfill our will by using cyber attacks. Therefore, cyber war is a new idea of war, a new concept of war. Doesn't exist. We do have cyber operations, we do have attackings, hacking, and so on, but it's not a new form of military conflict. In my opinion, cyber war and all the other stuff is currently part of conventional warfare on tactical level. And I think in Germany we call it electronic warfare. That's, in my opinion, a better term for this whole concept. cyber capabilities have to be incorporated into traditional military capabilities. Now you have a traditional military, some countries have militaries that go back for hundreds of years and they have their traditional capabilities, be it infantry, artillery, air force, reconnaissance and whatsoever. And militaries do have a long tradition of using electronic warfare. Now, we know that electronic warfare, 15, okay, I can't read that. Okay, bad font. The militaries use electronic warfare at least since First World War. Yeah? We know that the German teletypers were attacked by the French. They simply connected their own cables to the German cables and then they were able to read the signals. The Prussian optical telegraph was already built in the 1840s. It wasn't electronic, it was only optical, but it was a predecessor of future electronic warfare. Most militaries are familiar with electronic warfare. They have their own units or specialists working on that. And unfortunately, also in the military, there's a lot of hype going on about cyber war. I can at least can tell you from the German point of view that the military, of course, uses this hype to get more money, more personnel, and more resources because it's currently in the press and the journalists can say, yeah, we warned you about that. There will be cyber attacks and the politicians usually bow to that and resource or give them, allocate them resources. So why is there a hype of cyber going on? Cyber is cool, cyber is sexy. There's currently a PR campaign, an advocacy campaign going on by the German armed forces where they're trying to be cool by using Twitter and YouTube, and it usually backfires because they can't be cool. It brings in more money, personnel, the military gets more resources, and another interesting thing is that small actors can start to play that game too. Countries which cannot afford to buy a navy or to set up a tank battalion can now afford people who are trained in computer science, who are hackers, who are into IT security. So setting up a tank battalion is expensive, setting up a navy even more so. I just Googled for some numbers, at least for the German armed forces. The development of the Leopard 2 main battle tank shown here in the Austrian version cost around 500 million euros just to develop that tank. A training ammunition in Germany, the 120mm training ammunition costs 1,500 euro per shot. So if you want to train your tank crew with 10 shots, you are paying around 15,000 euro, which is a lot of money. You can buy a lot of computers with that stuff. You can even buy mainframes or maybe some other equipment. So countries that cannot spend this money for main battle tanks, naval ships or whatsoever can spend this money or the money they have on cyber capabilities. And that's the reason why we see small countries like Indonesia or other claiming that they are now investing into cyber warfare capabilities. They are setting up cyber units and they're training cyber warriors for cyber attacks and cyber and so on, because they can use their resources. The resources they have much better in that field. There's also another interesting thing. It's the change of a military paradigm, which was also already declaimed or claimed by Karl von Clausewitz. He said it's easier to defend than to attack. Think of warfare in the 19th century, or even a bit better when Vienna was attacked by the Turks. You have the fog of war on your side. When you are a defender, you have time to prepare. You have time to prepare the area, your town, the town walls, your guns, your artillery, and whatever you have. And that means the fog of war, of not seeing what's going on outside of your field of view, is on your side. You have logistics on your side. You've already set up your defense lines, you've set up your bunkers, your pillboxes, whatever you have. And of course, also the knowledge of the area helps the defenders. You know what's around, what's surrounding your town, what's around at your town walls, and so on. And this changes because the attacker has to find one single hole in your defense line. He has to find one single vulnerability and exploit it, and then he's in your network. And once he has root rights in your network, you're basically owned. You as a defender have to defend every single system. No? So if you have 50,000 computers up and running, you have to defend every single computer, every one of these 50,000 computers against an attacker. That means you have to put in much more resources into defense than into attack. The University of Dresden, they published a paper some years ago, and they said that you have to put in 5 to 10 times more resources into defending than into attacking. And for those who aren't into development, I just brought some numbers from the Netbeast project. The Netbeast source code is just the basic operating system. No Firefox, OpenOffice or other programs in it. 163,000 source code files. 57 million lines of code and more than 2 billion characters that have to be checked. There is not a single Netbeast developer who has an overview about the whole system. You have specialists in cryptography, in network drivers, in graphic cards, in video drivers, in sound and Bluetooth and other things, but there does not one single living person has an overview about the whole Netbeast project. And it's not a really big project, they're bigger ones. So verification is practically not possible. We can't use software, or we can't theoretically or practically verify software. We always have software with mistakes, with errors, with exploits, vulnerabilities, and so on. There's also another thing that completely changes the paradigm, especially from the military point of view. The victim can decide if it is attackable. That has never existed before in history, but nowadays the victim, or the other party of the war, can decide if it is attackable. Who forces us to put nuclear power plants online? No one forces us. Maybe some manager thought it's a good idea to lower the costs, to allow the sysadmins to work from home or something like that, but no one forces us actually to put nuclear power plants online. No one forces us to develop smart drives or to deploy smart drives which are accessible via the internet. Not smart drive, smart meter, sorry, smart meter. So what happens if we shut down our part of the internet, or at least the vulnerable systems? Do we have offline fallback systems? Can we shut down the internet, and do we still have communication measures for the armed forces? Can they use radios, or do they have their own telephone network? The German armed forces had their own telephony network in Germany, but it was shut down for cost reasons. Now they are discussing if they should bring it back in case the internet got shut down. Of course, it's cheaper to use the internet and VPNs to access or to bring every unit in the German army online, but having your own telephony network that cannot be attacked remotely from China, Russia, or wherever also has its advantages. What if my enemy hasn't reached the cyber age yet? Can we wage a cyber war against Somalia, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, FARC in Colombia, or other units or groups? I think a great example is the crisis or the attacks of Estonia and Georgia done by Russia in 2007 and 2008. They had no effect on Georgia because Georgia isn't in the cyber age yet. They were offline. The Georgian army is offline. So all attacks against Georgian cyber infrastructure, IT infrastructure, did have no effect on the military because they simply don't use the internet there, or didn't, at least in 2008, use it. So all the cyber attacks had no effect. So, once again, the victim can decide if it is attackable. Let that sink in. Coming back to the article published yesterday by the FAZ, the evil Russians, note the TM sign, cannot hack the German federal election because it is completely offline, and we have a paper trail. The whole election process in Germany is completely offline. There are no computers involved. The politicians wanted to introduce voting computers 10, 12, 15 years ago. The Chaos Computer Club destroyed the idea because they did the security analysis of the machines in cooperation with Dutch hackers, and they completely shut it down. And people said, we don't see a reason we can wait 2 hours longer for the election results if it is secure and safe. And it is secure because it's completely done on paper. No technology is involved in it. So we cannot get our German federal election hacked by Russians. That was just a scaremongering article. Another point I said in the introduction is I want to talk about cyber terror, or the idea or the discussion if there is a form of cyber terrorism, a known form of cyber terrorism. If you want to discuss cyber terrorism, we have to define it similar to cyber war, just with different goals and players. It's not state actors anymore, but we now have political actors, groups that want to change the government and the political system of a country with cyber attacks. So let's have a look into traditional terrorist group, just a small selection. RAF, Red Army Faction, not the Royal Armed Forces or Royal Air Force. In West Germany, they tried to introduce communism in West Germany in the 1970s. The Irish Republican Army, the ETA in Basque, the PLO in Palestine, FARC in Colombia, Al-Qaeda, ISIS nowadays, they are all traditional terrorist groups. So do we now have cyber terrorists? At least we have people who call themselves cyber terrorists, like groups like Cyber Jihad, Anonymous, the Syrian Electronic Army, and now we have to look at where do they come from and what capabilities do they have. Unfortunately, or sometimes journalists think that hacking a Twitter account is an act of cyber war. No, it's not. If you want to assess cyber terrorists, or if you want to ask ourselves, how do I grow a cyber terrorist? We have to look into the background, the culture, the educational system. And we have to ask if hacking groups exist in the countries. Can you imagine that there is a chaos computer club or a hackerspace in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia? Not really, or it might get hard to set up a chaos computer club in Saudi Arabia. Another thing that many people don't understand is that hacking is not formal training. You can have a degree in computer science, be it a Master of Science, a PhD, Microsoft certified, whatsoever. But having a formal training does not mean that you're a hacker. Being a hacker is more a thing of a Weltanschauung or the worldview. No? If you sit on your sofa watching TV and wonder how you can turn your TV remote into a Star Trek communicator, then you are a hacker. That's a prominent or very great definition by a very known German hacker, Vo Holland, and he said so. And I think that condenses it very much. Being a hacker is much more than having a degree in computer science, knowing IPv6 and finding buffer overflows in source code. So imagine, let's do a thought experiment. Think that a terrorist group, maybe a Salafist group like ISIS, send their members to study computer science, electrical engineering, mathematics, or whatsoever to a European or American university. Huh? There are people who give them money, lots of money, and they can easily afford to send maybe 18, 19-year-old boys to the University of London, Paris, Berlin, Munich, Prague, whatsoever, to study computer science. So they get people who are trained in computer science, but to become a hacker, they have to send them into hacking groups, like Chaos Computer Club, hacker spaces like the Meta Lab, and other things. And now, make that thought experiment. Can you imagine a hardcore Salafist joining a hackerspace? What might happen? They might turn into a hacker. They might become a hacker, but the hacker is also, being a hacker is also a worldview or a part of political beliefs. And when they become a hacker, they are usually no longer Salafists. You can't be a hacker and a Salafist and the same person. That doesn't work. If they will stay Salafist, they usually won't become hackers. They won't get that free sort critical thinking of hackers when they still are Salafists or maybe right-wing or left-wing terrorists. It doesn't matter if you're Salafist or Muslim. The same applies to right-wing terrorists, left-wing terrorists, environmental terrorists, and other people. The current operations by terrorists are very limited and rather simple attacks. Now, we had some incidents where the Twitter account of a French TV station was hacked, and many journalists said that's the end of the world and the cyber war has been won by the terrorists and we're all going to die next week. No, it's not. We're not going to die just because a Twitter account has been hacked by guessing a very, very easy password. So to sum it up, unfortunately, my resume, I have to go over some slides for time reasons. We have to measure the cyber capabilities as a multidimensional variable. We have to do it in a reliable, objective, and valid way. Make it scientific, science-based. We have to combine these dimensions. We have to look in economic, financial, educational benchmarks, the use bulge, industrial capabilities. Now, for example, we can use the PISA or TIMSS test to compare the educational systems of countries. We also have to look at openly look at two known political and tactical doctrines. How is the military working in that state? Is the military driving the country? Like in some countries it's the case, or do politicians have the saying in what are the doctrines of the military? Too much cyber is going on. There is so much discussion currently in the internet, in the media, where so much techno bubble is used by people who don't understand hacking or IT. Relax, don't panic, and do more science. That's my suggestion to do in this place. So I'm done with my talk. You can contact me via email. You can follow me on Twitter or Xing if you access the German network. You can also download our publications online. We have an open access journal, which is in German and English. And we have all articles from the last year's DeepSec proceedings online. So if you want to read the proceedings from the last year's DeepSec or from the articles we got submitted, we don't have articles for every talk. You find it online at our website in our journal.